It's the holiday season. Gifts have been exchanged. It's still cold as balls outside. But did you notice the one present from Carbine under the tree? Don't worry, it's pretty subtle. It was actually an email from NCSoft in German. Yes, this is how Carbine communicates to us now, about Drop 7 details coming on January 13th of 2016 at a presser, which means it's time to get hyped! Not really yet, though, but Carbine's been kind of super duper tight-lipped about what's coming in the next drop, which is kind of strange because the next drop is probably a pretty important one. But this allows me to do two of my favorite things. Number one, I get to talk about Wildstar, which I always love to do, and number two, I get to speculate rampantly on things that may or may not actually happen. So in my last video about Wildstar, I mentioned that Carbine kind of needs to press their advantage now, to start throwing out some cool content to keep the new player base engaged, so it doesn't really slide back down to non-existence. So these are some things that I would like to see come out of Drop 7. There are 4 of them. Let's talk speculation. So number 1 on this list is probably going to be the new raid and some new PvE content for Drop 7. This is the first major patch since free-to-play, which has been out for almost 3 months. A lot of those brave newbies have already been hitting genetic archives. They've cleared it. They're moving into Datascape. More guilds than ever are killing Avatas, which is nice to see. I'm really glad that he's kind of getting his what for. I believe before Wildstar went free-to-play, there were something like 12 guilds who had killed him. It's time for Red Moon Terror. It's time for the next tier so these people can keep going. Or, you know, whatever you've been cooking up. I want Red Moon Terror because I love Zombie Mordecai. But Wildstar rating is where it's at, and we need more! Now, the Red Moon Terror was kind of data mined like a year ago, so we've been really waiting to see what's coming up. It's been a big deal. I mean, Mordecai Pugbreaker might be making his zombified return. Time travel is taking notes. I'd love to see what the fine people at Carbine have cooked up. But more than that, I think due to Carbine having a smallish team, a major focus on a major aspect of the game might be super beneficial. PvE is, at least in my opinion and the opinion of a lot of people, at the core of what Wildstar is. In that case, new raids and dungeon content need to be kind of constant if we're going to be focused on smashing through them. But even more than that, what I would love to see, and what might wind up popping into more raids as we go, is what they did with the initialization core, adding sort of a hard mode that allows the raid to kind of straddle 2 different raid tiers. Perhaps Zombikai can be fought with or without some sort of borderline ridiculous laser gauntlet, because everybody loves laser gauntlets for extra rewards and extra fun. It adds replayability to the same raid. That means a smaller team like what we've got with Carbine can focus on getting more content out of the same art. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, and I very well might be, but based on what I've heard, art is a pretty big bottleneck when it comes to content design like this. Now, I'm not a designer, but this is kind of the gist I've gotten from people I've spoken to. I could be wrong, and Carbine could be completely different, but it's kind of what I think. Getting more use out of the same art, then, in this sort of Ulduar-style hard modes, like what was done with Initialization Core, would be a pretty smart move. I mean, more PvE content and less time, allowing you to work on even more raid tiers coming. Having hard modes might be a really big benefit. Adding and augmenting the bosses to get better rewards would be super cool to see. That's just my thought, though. Also, more dungeons. Dungeons are good. Maybe we can bring adventures back into relevance, like hard mode adventures that are on tier with dungeon. Double your effective dungeon content, why not? That'd be kind of cool, too. So the next thing I'd really like to see would be, I guess, number 2, relevant stuff to do outside of a dungeon or raid. Now, if you've been playing Wildstar, which you probably do if you watch my crap, you know 2 things. Wildstar has some of the best goddamn PvE content ever, and everything else is kind of This problem in the long term is a dangerous thing, because if all people are doing are dungeons and raids, you kind of will lose people over time, as you can't dungeon and raid constantly, although as much as I would love to. And with 6 dungeons and only 2 raids at the moment, this could cause all sorts of interesting problems. So let's take a quick ride back in time to Burning Crusade, because, you know, I love Burning Crusade. But BC gave you something relevant to do pretty much all the time. Whether you were doing a dungeon, whether you're doing a heroic, whether you're doing a raid, or whether you're out doing dailies or working on crafting or something, there's always something relevant towards your PvE goal to do in Burning Crusade. With Wildstar being a very PvE-focused game, and I mean PvP is fun, but the telegraph system is probably way better suited to PvE, Give us something outside of the PvE to do that matters. Solo, group, whatever. And I don't mean stuff like dailies or contracts, which are both good in their own ways. The current implementation of dailies in Wildstar is questionable. But, I mean, there could be other methods of doing things that would be interesting. So, I'm talking interesting things like rep factions we can work on. Something similar to, say, the Dragon Maw in Burning Crusade or the Isle of Quel'Danis. A rep faction with a narrative on its own that takes time but has some really valuable rewards. Some interesting quests and a lot of kind of nice stuff going on. I mean, who doesn't remember the Booterang quest doing the Nether Drake stuff? Or the Drake racing from Burning Crusade? There are dailies, but they were also really fun dailies. Or maybe you could integrate paths into this. I mean, once you hit max level with your path, it kind of becomes entirely pointless. And you guys have talked about how you want to kind of make paths a little bit more relevant. What if, say, there's some dig site somewhere in the world that scientists go to, and there's a big narrative chain that takes a couple of weeks to complete that comes out of this dig site about some Elden tech. Or the soldier path, there's this big front between the Dominion and the Exiles, and they're fighting, and there's this whole big thing between that. And these are sort of narrative experiences that take a good period of time to complete. That say, like, maybe don't require a huge amount of grinding, or maybe do, who knows. But require you to kind of come in and maybe find resources, or do science, or do exploration, or do something to benefit the goals of your path as a whole in order to sort of improve that. I would love to see paths have more relevance, because I love scientists. I'm a big scientist nerd, and I love paths. Also, more stuff like Omnicore 1 would be interesting. I know that's kind of PvE content, but it's solo PvE content. You can kind of do. I mean, the holiday events have proven that you guys are capable of creating some really cool stuff that requires a continual effort. I'd love to see that applied more long-term to the world, outside of dungeons and raids. Number 3, crafting. For the love of God, crafting. So, I've talked about crafting before, because RNG basically kind of ruins it. It makes it entirely unfun. The fact that it's tied to progressing in PvE makes it even less interesting. Crafting right now in Wildstar is kind of in a sorry state. There's a lot of really good ideas being hampered by a lot of really bad ideas. And I think that crafting is a big target on Carbine's radar, because a lot of people talk about how crafting is kind of unfun and boring and crappy, so we might see something improving it in Drop 7. Let me talk about how I would speculate if I could see crafting changed, how it would be. So first off, we get rid of RNGesus. Crafting needs to mitigate the current and horrible amounts of RNGesus that has caused people to have to undercharge their gear. Undercharging for any reason is not fun. Overcharging is fun because it adds that inherent risk. Undercharging is to mitigate a risk is not fun. The second thing I think would be more interesting would be to separate crafting from PvE progression. Currently, top-level patterns require stuff from Datascape, and that's fine, but decouple it. Add this new side path that allows perhaps more powerful and more long-term crafting projects that are more interesting. Perhaps add an item for gear crafters that progresses with them, say something unique that they need to work at, or specialized items and equipment that come apart from that basic crafting. I'm going to throw out a weird example here that may or may not be viable. I'm going to call it master crafting. Say you're a weaponsmith. You can craft a masterwork. They need to travel the entire world to find rare resources from all sorts of zones. These resources need to be refined in interesting ways. Say there's a special ore you need to get from, like, White Veil, and it's in, like, this little corner where there's a bunch of hard mobs, and, like, you have to find this ore, and it's really tough. Then you have to go to Skullcano in the Terraformer room, and so on, and then you kind of, like, forge the ore there in the maw of the volcano after you beat up Mordecai Redmond. Really like Mordecai Redmond. And then so on. You can have other things, stuff that drops from world bosses that you use for crafting. Kind of like, if you ever remember the Burning Crusade crafting epics. They were kind of really cool. They upgraded on top of each other. They were sets. They had this kind of interesting thing going on, and they didn't require PvE progress to craft. I think that would be really interesting. Give a whole new dimension to crafting and make it much more viable, I guess. That would be really cool to see, like this kind of sort of break away from PvE. Maybe add more crafting patterns, give crafters more abilities to change how they're crafting something. Take out the RNG, please. But that would be awesome. get crafting broken away, make it a little bit more unique and interesting. The last thing I would speculate will come of Drop 7, or at the very least that I would like to see in Drop 7, is more narrative content. So Wildstar's got this really interesting story. You've got the Strain, you've got Drusera and her weird obsessiveness, and the Primordials, you've got the Focuses, you've got this really well-crafted and deep world filled with all sorts of interesting lore. Now let's see some more come out of that over the next patch. Introducing things like Blighthaven and the Defile were really fantastic steps that allowed the story to kind of continue and evolve. Perhaps we can see this come up in other ways that don't necessarily require a whole new zone. I'd love to see things go kind of perhaps patch to patch. Not so much like Guild Wars 2 and their world story ridiculousness, but something similar on a smaller scale. Maybe it's baked into the PvE. It'd be interesting to see and give players kind of endgame direction. Or bake this into the non-group related PvE stuff that's outside of that. The new cool stuff like that Path faction stuff I was talking about, or rep factions with interesting quests. You know, new raids. You could kind of bake in this narrative in there, because Wildstar's got a really cool story, and I really want to find out what's going on. I want to go punch the Strain guy, the entity, in the face, because he's a dick. You guys seem to love lore. I mean, I've seen a lot of the Loremageddon stuff, and a lot of the wicked QAs with Papalicious. There's so much depth that you guys have come up with for this world. I am super excited to see it grow along with Wildstar. So, more narrative, I guess, would be what I would say. Maybe it's just because it's been a little while since we've really had a big narrative patch. I think the last one was Omnicore 1, because we had, like, Invasion Nexus and stuff like that. But, yeah, more narrative stuff, a more continuation of this story would be something I would love to see. Drop 7 and 8 are in the fire, apparently, according to quotes that you see on the subreddit and on the forums. And that's great to see. Carbine should really push that advantage right now. I would love to see Wildstar begin that kind of slow, steady growth you see from other MMORPGs out there. Games like Guild Wars or Star Wars The Old Republic. I mean, if Star Trek Online can still be a thing, I'm sure Wildstar can easily pull it out. Drop 7 is the first real chance to see that happen. Something I'll be following very closely and talking about a lot in the coming months. I've done some rampant speculation here. A lot of the things on here are things that I think might show up in the next patch, but also things I would love to see in the next patch. Some of it's based on what I've seen data mined, and some based on things that just would be good for Wildstar. We're free to play now. The gates are open. So let's see some goddamn amazing content, Carbine. I'm rooting for you. Why, hello there, and thank you very much for watching my video on Drop 7 at Wildstar and all this talk and speculation and things that I would like to see. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please do like, subscribe, support the channel that way. It means a huge amount, and it helps us continue to grow so that we may one day be even more awesome. But thank you again. I did something earlier this week that a couple of you saw. I released like a 10-second short. It was just like a stupid joke that I thought of. It got a little bit more attention than I actually thought. I wondered if you guys like that idea, and if I should do maybe more of those. Let me know in the comments. Either way, thank you very much for watching this video, and you have a great one.